We have to talk about it one more but final time. The Winds of Winter's delay. In our last two videos, we looked at George R. R. Martin's writing style, as well as the possibility of him releasing Winds in two parts. Today I finally want to look at the story itself. Specifically the storyline that I think George R. R. Martin is struggling with the most. Is Bran Stark George R. R. Martin's biggest Winds of Winter problem? Before I even start to explain why I think Bran's storyline is the hardest one to write, let's hear it from George himself.
The most difficult viewpoint character to write is Bran, and he has always been the hardest. He is the youngest viewpoint character, which is difficult in and of itself, because when you're writing a character that young, you can't simply write what's going on. You have to filter everything through, okay, he's 8 years old, what does he understand? He's seeing this scene. Does he actually understand what's happening in this scene? And finally, he gets involved more than any other character in the magical side of the fantasy. And magic is something that has to be handled very, very carefully in fantasy, especially a low magic fantasy like mine. All of these things make Bran very difficult to write, and his chapters I have to put together very carefully, and they tend to take me longer to write than the chapters of any other character.
Yeah, I can't even imagine how hard it must be. I believe that Bran's story is one of the main reasons why George considered doing a time jump after A Storm of Swords. Just imagine having to write the events in Bloodraven's cave through the point of view of a child. Part of it surely adds to the overall mystery surrounding the character of Bloodraven and the green seeing, because a 10-year-old like Bran definitely doesn't see things the way someone like Jon would. But you would also want to make it appealing to your readers. Bran's chapters do get a fair amount of hate among the fandom. Although they're not my personal favorites either, I don't mind them. It definitely took a long time for Bran and his companions to reach the cave, but I think that's exactly what's going to make it so rewarding when he inevitably plays a vital role in the endgame of A Song of Ice and Fire. Bran's character is involved in the storyline with the most magical aspects in the entire saga, and with only 2 books remaining, it's time for George to really reveal more about the others. There's no better way to reveal things than through Bran. Him not fully understanding certain things will leave us guessing and theorizing as well. It's safe to say that Bloodraven teaching Bran to control his green seeing is going to take up most of the content of Bran's chapters in Winds. Those visions are likely going to give us clues about the ending. I'm just guessing, but I think George is probably going to mislead us with ancient prophecies, specifically information about Azor Ahai and the creation of the others. Bran could see things from the past, and we're probably going to be left wondering about the true intention behind all of it. What's Bloodraven's motivation? What role plays the Great Other? I personally don't see a Night King coming into play in this story. I think that was a show-only thing to add a face to the Army of the Dead in order to simplify things for television. I like the idea of this creepy, hive mind-esque thing lurking in the dark in the books. It does make things way more difficult though. Another very interesting thing to keep in mind is that George actually cut a Bran chapter and supposedly moved it to the Winds of Winter. It was supposed to follow Jon's last chapter, so there could be yet another connection there. It's kind of mad to think about all of the potential twists we're in for in this book. With the amount of POV characters George has to deal with in the Winds of Winter, it's worth looking at the amount of Bran chapters we got in the previous installments. We have 7 in A Game of Thrones, 7 in A Clash of Kings, 4 in A Storm of Swords, and 3 in A Dance with Dragons. Let's say we get 5 Bran chapters in Winds. Can you imagine the pressure you must feel to set up the endgame in the north in just 5 chapters? Add to that the pressure of the entire world hating the way Bran became king in the television show. Yes, I do believe Bran is going to be king in the end. Not necessarily sitting on the Iron Throne in King's Landing, but I think he will rule. And that's where we have to compare the book and the show.
Move this man!
I know. Hear me out. Look, usually this doesn't make sense, because entire characters and storylines were cut from the books and never made it to the show. In this case, however, I think it's justified. First things first, let's look at the biggest difference. There is no Bloodraven in the show. There maybe was for like a split second in episode 10 of season 4. The mention of 1,000 Eyes and One hints at that, but there is no resemblance of Bloodraven in the character that the late great Max von Sydow plays in season 6. It has elements of it, sure, he is teaching him to control his green seeing abilities, and he is a very old being in a tree. Game of Thrones cut magic with every chance they had, and sadly they did it here too. But why is that important for Bran in A Song of Ice and Fire? Because the choice to do so came at a very interesting time. David Benioff and Dan Weiss met up with George R.R. Martin in 2014 to talk about his rough plans for the endgame of A Song of Ice and Fire. That was right before season 5, a season in which Bran doesn't even appear in. I think that George was still figuring out what to do with Bran in 2014, and D&D were probably letting him sit out a season in case he does eventually. Hodor's big hold the door reveal in season 6 is something that George told them. He said that although it is similar, it's gonna play out differently. I believe the same thing to be true for Bran Stark as king. This is just so random, so out of nowhere that I just can't help but feel that this is coming from George. While the show heavily simplified Bran, obviously they just used him to reveal things, to reveal Jon's parentage, George has to deliver. He has to show us how Bran turns into this powerful greenseer. He has to do so while simultaneously building up the main conflict against the others. It's just such a gigantic task. Again, there are not many chapters left for him to do so, to really take the time to build those things up. Another very interesting thing is this right here.
But I'm hoping you can remember for us the scene or the image that launched the series, A Song of Ice and Fire.
It was the first chapter of the novel Game of Thrones, not the prologue, which actually appears first. I wrote that later, but it was the chapter where they Bran viewpoint and they ride out to see the deserter beheaded, and then they find the direwolf pups in the summer snow.
Sure, that doesn't automatically guarantee that it's always been like that he always wanted to have Bran as king. But just imagine that man sitting there, writing his science fiction book, and then suddenly this scene pops up, and he thinks about this character, and then it kind of goes from there. Bran was the first character that he wrote. So I think there is a pretty high chance that he always intended for Bran to become king. And to then see the reaction online, people making fun of the ending, and people making fun of Game of Thrones as a whole, how could that not impact his writing and how fast he writes? If that is what he truly intended, and that was the reaction to how Game of Thrones executed his ideas, then oh boy, just imagine the pressure. I don't think that Bran being king is a bad thing. I think that George can do it way better than the television show. I think he can do it justice. So all in all, yeah, I think that Bran Stark is George R.R. Martin's biggest Winds of Winter problem. His biggest problem when it comes to the story itself. There are certainly other factors that come into place, other storylines that are definitely very, very difficult to handle. All of the other projects that he's been working on, and certain other things as well. But when it comes to the story, I think this is the biggest problem. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. That was definitely the last time we talked about the delay of book 6. We're finally going to talk about the actual story now. Apart from that, feel free to check out the previous 2 videos where I talked about Martin's writing style and the possibility of him releasing Winds of Winter in 2 parts. Feel free to subscribe, would very much appreciate it. And until then, take care and see us later.